Who knows what cinema lurks in the hearts of men? The cinephile knows.
Welcome back to Gentlemen Prefer Cinephiles Movies After Midnight, where we're just kind of going crackhead energy full bore from the start this time, I guess. And we are talking about 1994's The Shadow. Maybe the only reason I still tolerate Alec Baldwin as a person. That's how good this film is. So if you're not familiar with The Shadow was originally a 1930s pulp magazine character and radio play that was actually pretty popular at the time, and I will keep it short because this is a whole other video podcast thing. But there's a lot of really good like radio play era characters that aren't as fondly remembered today, just because they kind of predated the comic book years. And so if you're like of a certain age, you'll remember these characters. The Shadow actually got kind of rebooted by DC Comics in the 70s, so there are a lot of people who know him from that. And it's kind of like Doc Savage, where like they're characters that are a really big part of superhero history, but not really remembered by the general public as much as like a Superman or a Batman. Even though I think the Shadow predates, I'm pretty sure the Shadow predates Batman. I need to double check that before talking out my rear end. But so this film, 1994, actually a bit of history on that. Sam Raimi really wanted to make a The Shadow film, and he put in his bid for kind of getting the rights to do this, and they denied him. So he basically ended up making the Darkman films, or the first Darkman film, as basically Sam Raimi's version of The Shadow, with the serial numbers kind of filed off. And you can sort of see that in some of the aspects of Darkman, which again is a whole other podcast. Um, but the director that did end up with The Shadow, Russell Mulcahy, also director of one of the greatest films of all time, if not the greatest film of all time, Highlander. Um, and yes, I do know how to say Mulcahy because I watched a lot of MASH. Um, so about this actual film, I think it does a good job of combining the noir style and the superhero style in a way that's still really interesting today. I think especially with the kind of like increased saturation of superhero movies. Seeing an adaptation of a character who was sort of a pre-superhero in some text I've heard these characters referred to more as like an uh, yeah, I don't know, like mystery men or action heroes or whatever, because they're not quite like the world of The Shadow is kind of, it's very rooted in noir and in pseudo realism, and The Shadow specifically, his power is hypnotism. So basically, he doesn't disappear or fly or whatever, but he's able to cloud people's minds and convince them that he's disappeared and they can't see him or whatever. So it's out there, but it's subtly out there in a way that if you're in the right frame of mind, you can kind of like accept it as being rooted in reality. And so that's kind of, I think they captured that tone very well in this film. So we'll just kind of go through and give kind of a summary. They sort of blend the mythology of the radio plays and the pulp novels, because the radio plays were a little more lean and a little more family friendly compared to the novels, which went a little more in depth. Um, so you basically have a character, and Lamont Cranston is a guy who, in this, they establish he fought in World War I, and after the war was over, he kind of hung around China and made his way to Tibet. Um, was it Tibet? It was definitely around Asia. Um, but he basically kind of had this hunger for war and for conflict and personal gratification, and so that led him to kind of stay in the area and become this vicious warlord, drug user kind of guy. And eventually, this I can't remember its name now. I took a bunch of notes, and then I left my notebook at Erin's house. So that's the kind of professionalism you get on movies after midnight. So he is eventually sought out by this tulku, this sort of uh, I don't know, kind of like a um, yeah, I don't know what you'd call him, like almost a bodhisattva type person, even though that's a terrible analogy. But basically, this mystic seeks him out and says that they could sense the darkness in his heart, and that they want to redeem him and teach him how to basically how to control the darkness inside him and use it in a positive way. And then we cut 8 years into the future where he has learned these lessons and is now using what he's been taught to fight evil and sort of like atone for all the evil that he's done. And I think philosophically, I kind of like how they made that work, because like I think having listened to the original radio plays, if you ever get a chance, especially the original run where Orson Welles was voicing the Shadow is like just the episodes still really hold up. But the show kind of, I think the original stories were at least somewhat respectful, but they did have a little bit of that 30s, like, ooh, the Far East, it's all weird and kooky, and like that some people I guess could consider that kind of problematic these days. And I think this film did a good job of sort of adapting that and making it work in a respectful way without making it feel like we were just exploiting a culture and its mysticism, because it does seem like they really play with the like almost sort of Taoist ideas of like yin and yang, where that's philosophically that's a thing where in Judeo-Christian kind of mythology and morality, we think of it's important to have a balance that tilts more towards one thing, more towards good and light and honorable works and everything. Whereas in a lot of Eastern philosophies, there's this idea that like any excess is going to become a bad thing, whether it's towards kind of darkness and hedonism or towards light and positivity. If you have too much of one or the other, it will eventually lead you to kind of misstep. So you need to keep this balance between the two. And I think the way they apply that to the Shadow's backstory, I think works really interestingly, because you have this idea of characters who are, and I think it fits into film noir very well, because film noir is also very much about the idea of gray areas, and sort of everyone is a little awful, and it, like, depending on the film noir story, that can, different people are differing degrees of awful, and usually the least awful person is the protagonist, and that doesn't mean they're not a little awful, because everyone is awful. And so applying that to sort of the like Asian ideas of yin and yang, kind of, I think it fits in a really interesting way. Um, and that actually brings us to sort of to the villain that kind of kicks this film off. His character, he is played by Hong Kong actor John Lone. And the character is Siwan Khan, who claims to be the last living descendant of Genghis Khan, which is funny because I think statistically, like, at least 80% of any given population is probably descended from Genghis Khan or something like that. Like, the guy got around a lot, so, like, claiming to be the last descendant of Genghis Khan is kind of like a whatever, but, and again, I think it kind of goes back to this film was able to take characters that are sort of a little, like, curio shop novelty in terms of where they came from inspirationally, and turn them into something interesting, because Siwan Khan he's very rooted in like, the grandeur of the old world and wanting to live up to his great grandfather's legacy. I can't remember how many generations it is, but and so you almost, like, it would almost seem like we're getting this, oh yeah, he's evil and savage because he's from this other culture, but he ends up like mirroring Lamont really well, like to the point where he like asks him where he got his suit, and like starts dressing like him and telling him how they're pretty much the same. And from what you see, they basically are, like, they both have the same amount of potential, the same amount of ability, And so it ends up not really mattering where he came from, because they're both, these two men have both come from different places, but they're pretty much the same person, and the only difference is how they choose to use their abilities. And I think that's I actually wrote a paper once on how this film is really Hitchcockian, and like when you look at noir and you're like, oh, this noir is very Hitchcockian, that's kind of like saying a kung fu movie reminds you of John Woo or something. Like, it's duh, because he's such a ubiquitous director in that genre. But specifically, like, using some very specific Hitchcock tropes of the mirroring and the psychology of the way things work. There's this really great dream sequence where he has a nightmare where he's like peeling his own face off and he becomes C1 underneath, and it's like tying into his fear of like we are the same person and there's not much separating us. And it was a cool visual. And I think stuff like that feels very deliberately Hitchcockian, which I think is cool, because there's a lot of like Hitchcock has a lot of good tropes that people pick up on the surface level and don't always like delve into, and I think this film is one of the ones that actually delves into that, which was really cool. And also, it's also very Hitchcockian in terms of the character of Margot Lane, who is another returning character from the radio show. I think was when she was introduced as sort of his sidekick, who knew Lamont Cranston was the Shadow and like helps him gather information and stuff. And in this, she has kind of this latent low-level psychic ability, and she ends up being able to read, not only read Lamont's surface thoughts, but also she's like the one person his kind of hypnosis doesn't work on, because she is tuned into this psychic world, and like even to a stronger degree than she realizes at times. And I think that was very Hitchcockian, because in a lot of Hitchcock you have like a woman character who has this insight that's almost kind of otherworldly. Like I mean, I could go on about that. Like it's really interesting the weight that some like male directors put on like female characters being innately like insightful or something, and that's a whole other podcast as well. But like the way they approach it is like she's someone who has basically the man and the woman lead characters need each other's kind of insights and everything to work. And it almost ends up being very much like Spellbound, where she kind of eventually sees into his mind while he's dreaming and sees all the horrible things he's done, and is like the first person to forgive him and say, sort of exonerate him by saying, you're not this person, you have the capability for good and you need to embrace that. And so like again, there's a lot of character depth in this movie, and that's what I think makes it really good, is because superhero type stories are capable of a lot of depth, and they don't always get that. And I think The Shadow does that really well with everything I was talking about. Stylistically, I also really like this film. I don't even know, I guess you'd just call it the neo-noir movement. It was like around the early 90s, there were a lot of films, and that was when we got I want to say like people like LaVey Smith started in the late 80s. Groups like the Cherry Poppin' Daddies. There was like a neo swing in music that was coming back, and a lot of films like this, or like The Mask, or even The Two Jakes, if we want to talk about that. Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Like, there was this kind of noir resurgence, and The Shadow is, I think, a film that sort of exemplifies that early 90s noir look. And I think if you've seen any of those films, you sort of know what I'm talking about. But they really make it work, I think. Like, the way they illustrate Lamont's hypnosis a lot of the times is they have this shadowing effect where they pretty much box out just his eyes. Kind of like I think they did that with Dracula in the original like Bela Lugosi one. This podcast keeps coming back to Bela, doesn't it? And they do that, like, it's a really nice effect that kind of, it makes it feel like something that would have come out of the 30s or 40s. And also just the lighting and set design. A lot of the shots in this movie, there is some cinematography, like especially when they start using special effects and getting more intensely actiony, that it does feel very like 90s, early 90s. But a lot of the cinematography feels very like film noir, and I actually like turned the color saturation off, like set my VLC to black and white, and it actually looked really good, and a lot of the shots looked like things that made sense in black and white. And like that is like peak film nerd, but also I think it's cool when you can do that with a film, and like look at scenes and say, and like they look like they would have been come from a 30s or 40s film. And so that so stylistically this there's a lot of cool stuff. Also the way they handle the Shadow's transformation, where he like, because his whole power is like obscuring men's minds, basically they sort of have him I guess kind of hypnotize everyone into seeing him differently, and so you see him kind of develop this really big nose like the original artistic renditions of the Shadow. And I thought that was a really nice touch. And also like the Shadow just looks good from like even I don't have them here, but I bought a pack of they were like trading cards made for this movie, and they have like Jim Steranko drawings of a bunch of Shadow covers, and those are really cool. But so yeah, stylistically I really like it. Also, talking about the performances, so you have Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston, and like normally I just don't like Alec Baldwin that much, like as a person, and this film was able to kind of make me forget that I was watching Alec Baldwin and I was just watching like Lamont Cranston. So I think in terms of both his acting and in terms of the direction, I think that's a really good sign. Penelope Ann Miller is Margot Lane. We got Ian McKellen and Peter Boyle have like kind of minor parts, but they're both always really great. Tim Curry plays sort of the secondary antagonist. He's kind of this weaselly scientist who's really into Margot, and like, of course, she always turns him down, so he's like turning to evil for power and everything. And he really, really does the whole like kind of creepy, slimy guy really well. And like I've talked before on other things about like just Tim Curry in general is just a great performer. But I think having seen him, do like a Frankenfurter or something, like having played characters who are very like sexual and like like sort of powerful and on top of things, and seeing him play like the total inverse of that just as well, where he's this completely slimy, repulsive guy. It just kind of reminds you of like his acting range, which was really good. And his character actually ties into another thing. I like the way they depict the Shadow in this film, as even when he's being heroic, he's still in the spirit of the original. He's still very like sketchy at times. Like he is very scary, and he doesn't pull punches. Like when he faces down with Tim Curry's character, he basically commands him to just go jump through a window to his death, and he does, and it's really like metal. But again, like with the whole thematics of dark and light and everything, I really like the way that they depicted him. That they didn't, for the most part, they didn't soften the character for the film, and I really appreciated that. So those are most of the important beats. Oh yeah, we get Al Leong, who's a character actor from Big Trouble, or not really character actor, more of a stunt guy, I guess. Big Trouble in Little China. I think he was in Dusk Till Dawn. I can't remember, but you'd know him if you saw him. Yeah. That is the one. I guess the one thing, like they do a little bit of that, like Asian actor cross casting, which is always weird. Specifically, what's his name? Sab Shimono plays a bit character named Dr. Roy Tam. So you have a Japanese actor playing a Chinese rocket scientist. So like that does happen. The film's not perfect in that regard, but I think again the way they handle everything in the big picture, I think it all works, and I don't think there's anything that I would hold against this film. Uh, also, James Hong, uh, um, David Lopan from Big Trouble in Little China shows up at the start of this movie, and like, I just like Big Trouble in Little China is just really good. So any excuse I get to talk about that, I'm jumping on. Um, but yeah, that was The Shadow. I think like again, it was a sort of noir superhero film made in 1994, and I think it still holds up really well today, even against a lot of the superhero films that have come out today. And also, like, I just really like the Shadow as a character of being, I think because he represents that sort of fusion of like superhero noir, even to a higher degree than like Batman. I think he goes a little more into the noir direction, and so I think on that level, I think people who sometimes aren't into superhero films and think superheroes are a little over the top might actually find this a little more accessible because of that. Um, and yeah, overall, I think it's just really well made, and I wanted to get on here and give it my recommendation. So thank you all for joining me, and I will be back next week, I believe, because our schedule got a little Oscar week kind of had to switch things around, but I will be back next week, hopefully with a special little guest you've heard on here a couple of times out of the like two people that have been on this podcast regularly. So I will see you next time, and thank you for joining me.